Hi, and welcome to the Design Systems Podcast. This podcast is about the place where design and development overlap. We talk with experts to get their point of view about trends in design, code, and how it relates to the world around us. As always, this podcast is brought to you by Knapsack. Check us out at knapsack.cloud. If you want to get in touch with the show, ask some questions, or generally tell us what you think, go ahead and tweet us at the DS Pod. We'd love to hear from you. Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Design Systems Podcast. I'm your host, Chris Strahl. I'm here with Adekunle Oduye. He's with Plaid and works on the Plaid design system. Welcome to the program.
Hey, what's going on? I'm glad to be here.
Why don't you tell me a little bit about what you do at Plaid and the Plaid design system? Because this has got some interesting sort of leans to it that are a little different than most design systems.
Yeah, for sure. So I'm a design engineer on the Plaid design system. We're a team of 5, 2 design engineers, 2 designers, and then 1 design technologist. And yeah, our goal is to kind of basically build a lot of like reusable, accessible components and whatnot. But the thing is, like, when people think about Plaid, they think about, oh, it's like a API. It's just like, there's no like real UI, but we have a lot of products like Link, which is like what you use when you want to connect your bank account to like Venmo or any other financial apps and whatnot. And then we're starting to kind of have more dashboards for like developers and all that stuff. So our consumer-facing products are expanding. So that's how we have like a design system team right now.
Yeah, it is interesting because when you think about Plaid, I mean, I can see the logo in my head, right? Like I remember that, and I remember all of those steps of connecting like my bank to Venmo or to whatever service that I require some like sort of financial connection to. I even think like when I'm doing some credit checks and stuff like that, like when I'm buying something on the Google store or whatever, right? And so I can very easily visualize it, but I don't think I've ever gone to like the website and tried to experience any of that consumer product. But obviously there's somebody doing that. And I think it's interesting in particular when like your brand is sort of in the background or UI is in the background of what a user is trying to do. How do you think about designing for that?
It's interesting because like a lot of it, it's like, even though we're not like the end product ourselves, we're basically a product that serves other products. So a lot of times what people will do is they're like, hey, we're doing something where we need to get people's information. And usually once they start that process, there'll be some sort of like iframe or like Plaid workflow and whatnot. And in some cases, they want to kind of theme it to their liking so that users are not like distraught because they'd be like, wait, what is Plaid? What is like, why does this look so different and whatnot? So a lot of us is trying to figure out like, how could we be integrated into other products and be very seamless, but also kind of like a little bit promote what Plaid is? Because I think a lot of times people like, if they see like Plaid for the first time, I know when I first used it, I was like, wait, I'm not giving my credit card information to this company. I don't know this company, but especially with like passwords and all that stuff, especially for like banks, the last thing you want to do is just like give it out to some company and then they'll take advantage of it. So I actually had to do my research, and just like before I was working at Plaid to like understand what they did. And I was like, okay, it makes sense. And I think even for right now, we're getting to a point where we're kind of driving the initiative, like having accessible APIs for banking so that like it makes it easier for big companies like Bank of America or Chase to like mom and pop credit unions for people to transfer their money from their banks to like these other products and whatnot. So it's kind of invisible to a certain extent, but we still have like a lot of like dashboards that like developers use that we're able to kind of be more intentional with like our designs and be more visible.
It's fun to think about this idea of how do you have a brand that highlights other brands, but also still has to have its own like system of trust baked into it. And it's funny, you mentioned, you're a product that serves other products. Like that's how we describe design systems at Knapsack. We're like design systems are products that serve other products. And so, it makes me want to be like, well, if you were Plaid using Knapsack, you'd be using a product that serves other products that serves another product system that serves your end customer. I love how like meta design systems get really, really quickly.
Yeah, I think that's like one of the interesting challenges now compared to like my previous design system experience, where it's like, this is how a button should look like. This is how this heading should look like. We have to be more flexible because like different products have like different needs, and sometimes they want to kind of give the consumers or even like our product engineers the ability to kind of like make changes when necessary. So flexibility is the key because again, we're like super meta where it's like we're a product that serves other products. So, they might want to be like, oh, I want to change this button because like I'm Venmo and all the buttons should be blue. And be like, all right, we have to kind of support that within our system themselves, which could be tricky because the more flexible it is, the harder it is to kind of making sure that you have a cohesive design language. But it makes sense, especially in our use case.
So you'd mentioned kind of like other systems you'd worked on in your career before. Have there been any that have been like Plaid, and kind of maybe take us through that journey of how you got to this position that you're in right now?
Yeah, for sure. My first experience like working in design systems, and obviously I worked doing a lot of like style guides, and this is like when I was doing like graphic design work. But I think the first time I was like actually working on design systems was like when I was at Nasdaq. The interesting thing over there was like we were basically serving like financial products, and a lot of the products are like data heavy because our main customers was basically like hedge fund like managers that like basically want to know, like if I'm like Coca-Cola, I want to know who has ownership in my company, and that could be like thousands of like different corporations, individuals, and whatnot. So that was kind of like my first experience with design systems. And then eventually, after that project, I worked on like a data viz system, I would say. That was like very interesting challenge because I thought I knew everything about like charts and graphs and whatever like that. And when I was like diving deep into it, I was like, oh, I have no clue what I'm talking about. But it was interesting because it allowed us to kind of systemize like the process of like displaying data and also educating people about like the different data models and different graphs and like when to use one or the other.
Was it the visualization part that was the epiphany, or was it broadly just the idea of how people think about displaying complex data on the internet?
I think it was a little bit of both because in some cases, like we had like area charts, they were like very visual, but also like it was hard to kind of navigate. So a lot of it was kind of like understanding like the process of creating good like data viz. And a lot of it's like understanding the data. And then once you understand the data, you can really understand like what types of visualizations will work for that. And also like it depends on like the story you want to tell. So in a case where we wanted to kind of walk you through the process and then give you the right tools and patterns in place that allow you for you to kind of like take the information and create that visualization and kind of help tell that story. So I would say that was like probably the biggest challenge I ever had when working in design systems because it was like super new for me, but also I think what made it better was like having like a great team to like work with. And I think that was like the first time I worked with like a content person. I was like, whoa, a content person in a design system is like the key because we will like write documentation and she was like, wait, it seems like you're talking like in a foreign language, kind of break it down. And I think that kind of helped us be more approachable for like anyone within the organization to kind of understand.
So that's really interesting. You went from essentially doing graphic design and style guide work, producing, presumably like PDFs or Photoshop files of how things should look, to actually working on this systems team. And that first exposure, you had something that was very data heavy, something that was very visualization heavy. And you also got to work with somebody on the content side to help you sort of shape the language of that design system. How was that first experience? Maybe give us an idea of what it felt like going into it and then what it felt like coming out of it.
Yeah, I think going into it, I was unsure. Like I thought I was like, well, I've done style guides before. I should be able to do it. It should be the same thing. And I think the difference was like there's a lot of aspects around interaction, animation, and especially around like dashboards that we were creating. Like a lot of it's data heavy. So like we actually had to be very mindful of how you like we want to display data and whatnot. So it was a lot of like thinking about like, all right, what makes sense, but also like understanding like who's using our actual design system. Because I think one of the bigger mistakes I made was like, oh, I'm designing for myself. And I was familiar with design, I was familiar with code. So I'm like, okay, I could like make this work. But then one of the biggest pain points was like sometimes it was like too technical for like non-technical designers to be able to like use it, or sometimes it was like hard to like use the system overall. So that's where I started to kind of really understand like really take an account for understanding your users, doing user research and testing your design system. Because I think oftentimes people design for themselves, which is cool, but I think at the end of the day, like it is a product itself. So you want to kind of act like a product where you kind of do small iterations and you kind of test and you validate and you get testimonials and whatnot, because I think that will help you kind of like validate that you're going down the right direction. And also, if anyone has like from the business side wants to say like, well, do we need to design systems? We have enough information to kind of back up our work. So that's kind of like the thing I came out of it, where it's like you want to like be scrappy in the beginning, but also making sure that like you're getting feedback and validating as quick as possible.
I like what you said there about considering the business case for the design system. In particular, this idea that there's some justification that you have to make for why the decisions you're making really matter. And it was also interesting to hear you talk about some of the stuff that was challenging at the beginning, right? The idea of things like states or animation or all those things that are difficult to represent in design tools. How do you represent those in a design system in a way that doesn't feel too technical, that is still approachable, but ultimately is not very easily represented in something like Figma? And so maybe like let's explore those things one at a time. Let's talk about first this idea of this transition from working in design tools to working in design and code, and some things that you could do in the design system that were not as easily expressible in your design tool.
Yeah, a lot of it was around interactions and animation. Even when I was working on that design system, I think we were still using like Photoshop. Like this is like before Sketch, so this is like super old school. There was a lot of tools that like show like animations and like how to do them and interactions, but I found it super useful just to kind of build out a sandbox and kind of be able to like demonstrate the animation, but also have other people test drive it. And I think from there, that was like a way for us to kind of get buy-in as a team, but also it could be a teachable moment because we can like teach like the like technical aspects of it and really making sure they're aligned from both like a design perspective, but also like a developer perspective, and making sure like we're using like the same language overall. And then for interaction, I think it's the same thing where it's like, again, a lot of the stuff we do is not static. So, you know, you're going to click on specific things are going to pop up, whatnot. I used to use like After Effects and all that stuff to kind of like demonstrate it, but also it's like, it's not showing the actual experience overall. So that's why I think my goal is always to kind of show like how the end experience is going to look like, because that will like ground people and ground ourselves to kind of see like this is what how it's going to look like versus like, hey, this is how it might look like, but it might not be as smooth because like we're using like web technology and it's not going to be that clean. We're not going to be able to like animate specific things that way, because also animation is a hit to performance. And I think that's another thing I always want to demonstrate, where it's like we could animate all this stuff, but keep in mind of like how it's going to feel from the end user is super important. So I think that's kind of like why, especially making that transition was like super hard, but I think making sure that you demonstrate it well enough, not only to yourselves, but your team, was super beneficial because it allows you to kind of iterate and move forward. And also, if you want to test it with like users and whatnot, you're able to do that in a way that they can interact with it versus like if I'm using like After Effects or anything like that, where it's more of a demonstration, if that makes sense.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, actually being able to see something in the medium it's destined for is really powerful, right? Because you can do all sorts of stuff with, video playback that is a facsimile of what's going to happen in a user experience, but it isn't the user experience. And one of the things that I always had a really hard time with was like something as simple as timing, right? Like, what does a 200 millisecond versus 600 millisecond fade in look like on an actual website, right? And having to go through that process of like, okay, let's update the code so that timing changes. Let's do another build. And then let's like actually see it live, 11 minutes later. You don't remember what the difference between 200 milliseconds and 600 milliseconds is. And so the ability to do that in a design system now, where you're actually using code and you're just injecting that variable in runtime, like we've come so far.
Yeah, it's wild.
So shifting gears kind of away from the technical details side of it, that's a really good case, by the way, for like why design systems matter and why we've like a practical transition point. But now thinking about like that business case behind why people build these and why they're important. One of the things before the show that we talked about that I thought was really interesting is you constantly refer back to the business reasons why these things exist. So in those early days, like what were those business reasons? And then, as your career has progressed, have you continued to highlight those? Talk to me about that.
That's something that ingrained in me, especially the first time I was working in design system, because working in a big corporation, you actually have to like fight for pretty much everything. Like you have to fight for like to do user research, you have to fight to kind of just like exist and whatnot. So the major thing, and even like before I was getting into design systems, I used to do a lot of like prototypes and design like very quickly, whatever like that. At the time, like we had like some sort of like UI library, but it wasn't like as mature as we wanted it to be. And the problems we kept on facing was like it was preventing us to kind of like take ideas from concept to completion. And also like there's around things around like accessibility and whatnot. And there's some stuff that like when you're building like workflows or looking at like particular views, like you don't want to kind of keep on thinking about the same thing about like how buttons can look like and all this stuff. Which is like it's weird because like I think oftentimes like I remember back where like we had discussions about like, oh, should the button look like this and that? And in my head I was like, I don't really care because like I'm down to use whatever like people want to use and then just kind of focus on like solving problems for the user. So I think that's kind of the first case where it's like the less we're focusing on like how it looks like, then the more we can kind of focus on like, hey, is this thing going to solve people's problems? And I think that's the idea where it's like it makes it feasible to kind of move fast and also have some sort of like production quality built in so that when you have to like productionize it and whatnot, you don't have to spend a huge amount of time to kind of do it. So that was kind of like the first business case around that. Ever since then, like it's kind of been a habit for me to like anytime I'm starting a new design system to do research, kind of get understanding of like the business goals, the needs, what people are struggling with, and figure out how the design system can kind of influence those projects because then you can kind of prove like the impact to the business. So even like we're now working on like dark mode and dark mode's like accessibility win, but also a lot of clients been asking for it. So doing that within the design system is kind of directly showing that we're being impactful to the business overall. I always tell people that, especially when they start in the design system, is like don't really necessarily focusing on like the frameworks and all this other stuff. I was like, understand the business and what are the specific pain points, and figure out how the design system can resolve those pain points.
Yeah, certainly. Hearing you talk about this, it reminds me of the practical justifications of like user effectiveness, right? There's this cartoon that I love that is all about a bunch of different tasks and they're represented by balls, right? And the big hard tasks are like huge, right? They're these big balls and they're like the little easy tasks, these little tiny dots, right? And they're all lined up in a line behind a velvet rope to get into a club. And the bouncer's like, all right, everybody line up by order of importance. And the very first thing in line is the biggest ball in the entire, system. And he's like, okay, never mind. Everybody line up by difficulty. And then it's like all the small balls line up first and then the big balls later on. And they let all of the little balls in. And then it gets to the big ball that's really important. And he closes the rope and he says, sorry, we're full. And that to me like perfectly indicates this idea of human nature and how it oftentimes conflicts with business value, right? Like you want to do that big hairy thing, but you have all these little things that basically show that you've made some progress, right? Like, hey, we did a thing. There's people in the club. We let them in, but it's not the most important thing that you could be working on. And oftentimes by the time you accomplish all those little things, it takes so much of your attention away from that big thing that is really important. You end up in this place where you're not really business aligned. And I think that your idea of starting with research to really understand what those priorities are, that helps you be able to set expectations with the business. Like, hey, we're going to go tackle this like really big, hard problem. It's going to take a lot of attention. It's going to be a little while before, it gets let in the door. But at the same time, it's going to be really, really valuable for this company.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I always like this quote I have where it's like small steps, great distances. The reason why I use that, especially around design systems, because oftentimes like people want to do like these major like redesigns and all that stuff. And I'm like, all right, cool. This is what you want to do. And I just kind of like break it down, break it down, break it down. So it's like, all right, what are some things that are like could be like quick wins? And this is something I've done in one design system where it's like they had like 20 different types of buttons. It's like, all right, cool. One great like small win is like to create a button component and basically replace all the instances and whatnot. And then we're able to kind of show like, hey, oh, it's like make it super easy to kind of update all those buttons, but also we were able to kind of like show that like the actual performance improved because like we were shipping like less code and whatnot. And then we're just kind of building like on top of that and little by little until like you kind of look at it and be like, oh, it's like a totally different thing. And like the user experience, but also like the developer experience is like way better.
And nobody ever has to think about the button again.
Exactly. That's like the one thing I truly like despise, where it's like conversations about button, because it's so simple, but also it's like difficult at the same time. And I remember like in one case we had like 130. This is when we're using Basecamp. 130 comments about like buttons and the styles and whatnot. And I was like, yeah, I'd rather not think about the button. I was like, I use whatever button people use. At the end of the day, as long as it works properly and it's accessible, that's all I care about. I feel like that's like the intro into design systems, like figuring out like the button, or also like button versus the link and all that stuff. So
yeah, the designer's bike shed, right? There's this great idea that I have for a piece of swag to hand out at a conference at some point that is like a button that is of a button. So you can have that like meta association of the design system with the thing that we all like hate to argue about most in the design system, which is the freaking button that everybody feels like is like there's 100 hours that went into deciding this button pattern that has been a solved problem across millions of companies and websites over the past 20 years. Like, why are we reinventing the button and spending 100 hours on this? So eventually I'm going to hand out a button swag of a button.
This gets back to the business talking point where it's like, can you justify it to like the CFO or whatever like that? So yeah, we're going to spend like 100 hours like figuring out like the proper button styles. And they'll probably just look at you like, that doesn't really make sense. So that's kind of like where you want to think about it from more of like the business standpoint. It's like, is this something I should be working on right now? And is it going to be the most impactful to the actual business? And if not, then you probably want to like focus on something else. And I kind of like, that's kind of how I prioritize like what I'm going to focus on. If you don't, then you could literally spend like 6 months designing buttons or icons and not really showing like impact to the actual business.
Yeah, I was reminded of that XKCD comic where Randall Monroe is talking about if you put two people in isolation together for long enough, they'll develop strong opinions about pretty much everything. And it's two people that get locked in a room with nothing but pictures of Joe Biden eating a sandwich, and they have strong opinions about which photo is better. And human beings will argue about anything, man. I mean, you put them in a base camp and you say, we're going to talk about a button. That's to get 132 comments. But at some point, there is like this step back about like, is this actually valuable? And I think that one of the hard parts of it, right, is that sort of isolating feeling that happens in a lot of these organizations about like, well, if I'm not working on the button, then what am I working on? And then, you look at that big hairy ball and you're like, wow, that's a big, hard problem. It's going to take me forever to tackle that. So it's easier to just make another comment about the button. How have you solved that problem?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a big fan of working with your users. So like as a design system person, I've done the cases where I just like work with like a lot of product folks or product engineers or product designers on like building problems and whatnot. I didn't realize it until like I got out of design system. Like I was doing mostly like prototyping, product design work. Then I got into the design systems. Like sometimes you work in silo. It's like you think this is a problem, but it might not be a problem. It might be a problem for you, but it might not be super impactful for your like consumers. I worked with a lot with product designers to kind of like prototyping like examples and actually using the design system itself. And I could kind of see like, wait, this doesn't make sense. We should improve this, or we need to kind of include that into like our design system, because that's kind of in the case where like we've seen the problems they're facing and then basically creating solutions for them and whatnot.
So your idea is to try to move beyond the abstraction pretty quickly, right? Instead of like, let's all argue about a button, let's actually like use the button in context for solving a user need and then see what problems we run into. And those are the things that are important to tackle, not like, the 400th button state. And by the way, I agree with you. I think that it's sort of akin to what you were saying a while ago, earlier in the episode, where you were talking about how it's oftentimes difficult to realize that my problems are not necessarily the business's problems. And I think this is kind of another example of that, where you're basically saying, okay, so we have this abstract concept vis-a-vis a button. How do we actually get some concrete implementation of that we can learn from? When you think about how you move into that practical space, how do you bring others along with you on that? Like when you think about working with that product designer or working with that design technologist to go from more than just here's a collection of components to here's a finished experience using the design system, what really galvanizes that for you?
I have an approach where it's like you focus on building the right thing, then you focus on building the thing right. So it's very hard, especially for me, like working abstractions, because like there's no proper context and whatnot. So I've done in a case where I worked with the designer on like we wanted to kind of set patterns for like pages and like how like the different types or whatever like that. So what we basically did was like we just created a prototype of like all these different pages. And mind you, sometimes like we were using like the design system, sometimes we had to like break out of it because it didn't like fit the use case. And then like we got feedback on it. And we're like, all right, we're going down the right direction. Then we're able to take a step back and kind of seeing like, all right, what are some things that are similar and be able to like abstract out. And I think like working from that perspective, it makes it easier to kind of see like, all right, this is like the actual experience and we can kind of basically abstract out like the components and like see like different patterns and see them in context of the page. And I think that's one issue I've seen a lot, especially design system teams, where you go into isolation, you like really focusing on the button or like the badge, but then when you put it in the context of a page, it doesn't work because it's not cohesive enough. Some people might not like working like this, but I think for me it's the best way because it'll kind of forces you to kind of making sure that you're building something that people are going to use and it's going to work in context of like the overall experience of the product itself.
Yeah, it's kind of going back to like some core atomic design concepts there, right? Like, you need those atoms and molecules, but then ultimately, like, people don't consume individual bits or individual components. People consume pages. I think that there is this myopia that just kind of comes into play when you're building in a system for so long, where you do think about those components in isolation without that context so frequently that it is really important to take that step back and to say, like, hey, what does this actually mean in terms of advancing the user experience? Or what user value is being derived from this thing that I'm building? When you are relating it back to the business goals, so now you're talking to that CFO and you're talking about the button that you built and then how that button relates to the context of the broader thing. And maybe you're not even having that conversation because you're probably actually talking about the end experience. What is it that you do say that justifies that design system? Like, you can't say like we spent 100 hours on this button, but what can you say to that person to basically say this is aligned with our business goals?
I think when you're speaking to like business people, you always have to kind of tailor to like the language they understand. So if you're talking to a CFO, you're going to talk about like, all right, the design system is going to like save designers and engineers X amount of time. And I think it's hard to kind of quantify it because I think in some cases you might have to do like a research to kind of say like, how long does it take for a designer to build like a button versus like using the design system component? But that's kind of how I like to approach it, where it's like it's going to save time and money because like time and money is like the most important like valuable things, especially around the business where you're always trying to like push new features and whatnot. And then if I'm talking to like a marketing person, whatever like that, we could kind of say like, hey, with the design system, if you want to do any like a rebrand or refresh or whatnot, if you change it from the design system standpoint, anything that uses the design system is going to inherit those changes, making it easier for us to kind of like move quickly and be able to kind of do the redesign in a timely fashion and whatnot. So I think you always want to like tailor it to like who you're talking to because again, different people have like different goals and initiatives. But I always think like you want to kind of tie it back to like is either going to save you time, money, resources, or it's going to improve the experience of your end users and whatnot in order to kind of really sell the importance of design system overall.
So you've talked a lot about the language you use, the business case. How have you continued to bring that forward as your career's advanced? Because you had this very heavy design lean, and then you kind of moved into this code lean, and then you got this like product side of it too. And those are the three major disciplines. I guess maybe you probably even done some work with content at some point. How has that kind of evolved? This thinking about how to speak in business language that people understand, this idea of how to get a design system off the ground and adopted. How's that kind of changed your role as you've moved through your career?
Yeah, a lot of it stemmed from just like not having enough resources. Early in my career, like especially when I was working on style guides, it was like I had to like wait for an engineer in order for them to like start implementing it. So I was like, well, I'm just gonna start doing it myself. And then NASDAQ was probably the first time I was able to kind of combine both of them together. And then right after that, I kind of like took like a design role, and it was like only design. And I realized like, yeah, that's not me, because like I like to be in the trenches. I like to like prototype and code and whatnot. And this role started coming up where it's like, oh, like design technologist. And I was like, oh, like that seems perfect for me, because like I work in the design department, but I'm more technical and I'm working with like engineers day to day and whatnot. And the great thing about that was that like sometimes you have to be like a translator between like two different disciplines, where it's like design is like speaking one language and then engineers speaking another language. And you have to kind of be able to like bridge that gap, so to speak. So that's when I started to think where it's like, I really like this like hybrid role of like being able to like design and code, and also depending on like whatever situation that I'm faced, like one minute I might be designing a dashboard, another minute I might be prototyping, another minute I might be like focusing on like building design systems. So the role I had after that, I was a design technologist where I was like focusing on design systems. And then eventually I ended up at MailChimp, where if people don't know, MailChimp was probably had like the oldest like style guide.
A very early investor into systematic approaches to design.
Yeah. And you can like tell it like just like by using a product, but also like once like a company is like a design focus and also like they understand the importance of design systems, it made it super easy to kind of like get things done. And we were able to kind of like support like a lot of like the brand refresh and do it in a way where the system was kind of like the foundation aspect of it. And I was there for like around 3 years, and it was great because I was able to like work on components, but I did a lot of like prototyping. And the one thing that was super beneficial for me was being able to like have this like design system as a service approach, where I go work with teams and whatnot, and kind of like being like a consultant and help them like achieve their goals or whatever like that. And the one thing I did that was super helpful was that I was able to kind of like help them, but also it was a great time to kind of like teach people about the design system and really understand like what works and what doesn't work for the design system. And I was able to like take my findings and communicate it back to the team. So being in this like hybrid role is like, I enjoy it because like every day is like different, and also like you have different problems, but also you're able to like work with a larger set of people. And you might be a case where you're working by yourself, but that's okay because you have like the necessary skills and experience to be able to take any idea from concept to completion. So that's something that I've really enjoyed, especially in the past couple of like years and places I worked at.
Awesome. Well, Adekunle, thank you so much for sharing your personal journey. I really appreciate you taking the time to chat with us. Learned a lot about some of the early challenges around design and engineering. And it was great to hear your perspective, kind of past, present, and future, for how design systems are related to businesses and also how they've sort of changed you. So much appreciated. Thanks for coming on the program.
Cool. Thanks for having me.
Take care. That's all for today. This has been another episode of the Design Systems Podcast. Thanks for listening. If you have any questions or a topic you'd like to know more about, find us on Twitter at the DS Pod. We'd love to hear from you with show ideas, recommendations, questions, or comments. As always, this pod is brought to you by Knapsack. You can check us out at knapsack.cloud. Have a great day.